But do check our website, fcchk.org, for all of our upcoming events. Unfortunately, I'm told the one we just advertised for next Tuesday may already be sold out. So if you're not in a hurry, that's going to be Executive Council member and Legislative Council member Regina Ip. But you'll also be able to catch that on the live stream or our YouTube channel later on if you're not there for that one. And we've got some other great events planned, so please do keep an eye out on our website or our Twitter feed. If you're not following FCC on Twitter, you're doing it all wrong. so do keep an eye on what we have coming up. And I want to also recognize we've got a couple of board members here and also our Claire Hollingworth Fellows. But for the time, we're still eating, so you don't have to get up and wave or do anything. But the title of our book talk today, and we love doing book talks, is Superpower Interrupted, The Chinese History of the World. Our speaker Michael Schuman, is a journalist and author who has lived and worked in Asia since 1996, and I believe that's where we met, if I'm not mistaken, sometime around then, and maybe
I think so.
In Indonesia or Southeast Asia.
During the financial crisis.
During the Asian financial crisis.
But we're really not that old. We were really young.
We were children at the time.
We were practically toddlers, I think.
We were children at the time,
Yeah.
but we did meet. I think it was in Indonesia, if I'm not mistaken. We were crawling around on our hands and knees. You've had some earlier works like Confucius and the World He Created, which was by Basic Books, which was my publisher, so it must be good. And also The Miracle, the epic story of Asia's quest for wealth, that was put out by Harper Business in 2009. And you are currently a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion and a contributing writer to The Atlantic, where I seem to follow you. So, before that, you were a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and also for Time Magazine. So, without further ado, let's give a warm FCC welcome to Michael Schuman.
Thank you.
And Michael, it really is good to have you back. We've been planning this for a while, so thank you for being patient with us.
Thanks for staying with it overall all this time. I appreciate it.
And if you haven't had a chance to read the book yet, as I have, then you may not know kind of the whole shape of his argument here. But and correct me if I'm wrong, I'll give you the floor in a second. But Michael, when he went to London at some point and went to school, or the UK, right? And you,
Me?
Yeah, no. You heard that when you're in the UK, they teach a different type of history than they teach in the United States.
Right. I mean, actually, the way it started is thinking about how I learned history.
Right.
Right. Where I grew up in New Jersey, which I actually don't usually admit to so many people, but and I went to just regular kind of public high school in New Jersey, and my choices of history were you could study American history, or you could study American history. And other parts of the world kind of floated into this American narrative whenever it became relevant to that narrative, right? So you learned about Europe usually in the context of the World Wars, and you learned a little bit about China, usually John Hay and the open door policy and little tidbits like that. But and this started me thinking that this is probably how most people around the world learn history, right? That they learn a history that is considered, I guess, most relevant to them and the society that they're in, and where that society has developed and come from. And so this got me thinking, well, the Chinese actually have their own narrative of history that they learn, and that it's very familiar to them, that people in the U.S. and Europe and elsewhere only know little bits of. And the reason I thought this was important is because we are, I think, all in part shaped by our history, and I think more importantly how we learn our history and how we perceive our history, or in some cases misperceive our history. And this creates a certain worldview, and how we see ourselves, how we see our countries and societies, and how we see that they fit into the world, the greater world. And my sense of what's going on now, as we seem to be heading, unfortunately, into a new period of superpower competition, that you can see these different worldviews that we would have in the U.S. or in Europe, and what the Chinese have, be playing a role in this unfolding and unfortunate competition, and how the two sides definitely see the world, see their role in the world, perceive where the world is going and where they belong in that world, and the history is very much a part of it. So I thought it would be useful for people around the world to know more about this Chinese narrative and how the Chinese tell their history and think about their history, as a way of kind of understanding where modern China is today, what the Chinese ambitions are, and where the Chinese, and especially the Chinese leadership, see themselves and the country in this greater kind of global context.
Well, I grew up in Detroit, which is kind of like New Jersey, and studying history in high school or junior high, you look at a map of the world, the U.S. was always right at the middle, right?
Right.
And Asia's on one side and Europe was on the other side. What is that Chinese map of the world like?
That's an interesting question. Actually, there are some good Chinese maps. I'm not so. I assume it would be the opposite. Because going back to very early writing in China. I mean, you're going back to the classics, basically, right? The Chinese had a view of the world that was basically a series of concentric circles, right? And and China, and specifically wherever the ruler was, that was the center of all of these concentric circles. And the farther out the circles were, in other words, the farther away you were from the heart of Chinese civilization, the more barbaric the world became. And that goes back to actually the classic of history, actually, that idea. So you do have very old ideas in China about the Chinese, not as of course as a country, but as a civilization, being at the center of everything else.
Explain that your title, Superpower Interrupted. What do you mean by that?
It started with this idea that China was not, of course, always a great power. Not every year, not even every century. We know I think sometimes Chinese history is taught as a series of dynasties, and they just one replaces the other. But it's actually, of course, not really like that. There were long periods when the country wasn't politically unified, and there were civil wars, and there were invasions, and assorted other disasters. So, but what I do think is amazing about Chinese history is how frequently the Chinese people and the Chinese political elite were able to rebuild themselves into a great power. I mean, that's the fascinating part of Chinese history. How often you have, a restoration of a new dynasty, and this restoration of China as a great power over and over and over again. And but I think there was something of an interruption in this process, and that's where the title comes from. And I think the interruption came actually with the arrival of the West and the Western powers in Asia, because what made that different was the Chinese, of course, have confronted all kinds of different kinds of people over the many centuries of history, but throughout it all, they maintained kind of this idea that their civilization was still a superior civilization. Like, okay, we got invaded by the Mongols, but they had to adopt our way of living and our ideas, because our civilization is superior. So okay, so we lost on the battlefield, but we really didn't lose as a civilization. And I think what happened with the confrontation with the West is that the Chinese ran into a different group of people who basically thought the same about themselves, that they were a superior civilization and had superior ideas. And because of the better technology and other things that the West had at the time, the Western powers could actually back that up. And this started basically something I say a crisis of confidence, a crisis in cultural confidence in China, where really for the first time in any meaningful, concerted way, the Chinese political elite started to doubt the value of their own traditions and civilizations, and they felt that they needed to completely change their society in order to be a competitive people and nation again. And that's the interruption that is in the title. And I think we're still seeing the effects of that right now. And it's what's happening today is kind of an outgrowth of this interruption, what was this recurring pattern of Chinese history.
Explain that a little bit more. You know, if we look at Chinese history in the 20th century, you know, we see a lot of civil war, then the Japanese invasion, then the Communist Party comes to power, then we see a lot of tumult because of the Cultural Revolution and the various campaigns. So we see Chinese recent history as kind of very tumultuous, but they see that as almost the aberration period, right? That's not what they see.
Well, you know what? There's two ways of seeing Chinese history. One is that you have a series of what were very, very powerful imperial dynasties that, yes, rose and fell, but that China was the dominant power in Asia for at least long stretches of time. And especially, I think what's also very interesting about Chinese history is that even when China was not necessarily a great military power or even very politically dominant, it was a very important civilizational, power where China's neighbors still continue to look to Chinese civilization for ideas for their own legal codes and governing systems and literature and art and architecture and social norms, that kind of thing. But if you want to flip it around, and I've seen people do this, you can say, well, actually, the periods when China was a great power were more the aberration. That China was actually either in disarray, or when you see the years on a chart of the Chinese dynasties, it's not like they were super powerful until they suddenly collapsed. So you always had these periods, in some cases, very long periods, like at the end of the Han Dynasty, for instance, where you had these very long periods of kind of political decline. So you can, history is what you make of it. So I think the Chinese today, the leadership today, especially, and the message that they're selling to their own people and to the world is the former way, that, China has traditionally been a great power, and we have been for very long periods of time, and now basically we want to return to basically what was always the norm. We in the West talk about the rise of China as if it's something kind of startling and new. Well, this is the big story of the 21st century. How do we fit China into the world basically that we created? And that's not an untrue narrative, but I think the way that the Chinese see it is like, well, wait a second, what's actually new and startling is that you guys from the West actually had all this influence in Asia, and what's happening now with the rise of China is almost something that's a return to what had been normal for much of history, and in that way, I think a better way of describing what's happening is not so much the rise of China, but almost the restoration of China. I think that's how when you read Xi Jinping's speeches, which I've done far too much of, you see him return to this theme over and over again. China was a great power, and we're going to be a great power again. I mean, that's really the substance of the Chinese dream, and a big part of his messaging.
Yep, and America, by comparison, is only about 250 years old, correct? So we have a much shorter history.
Well, it depends on which form of the current communist regime only dates 70 years. So it depends on how you want to measure these things. Obviously Chinese civilization is very old, but if you want to go back, of course, to the roots of Western civilization, Socrates and Confucius were near contemporaries. So
that's interesting. Do you think a clash is inevitable between the United States and China at this point? We hear about the Thucydides trap and other scholars speaking about this inevitable clash of a rising power and a existing power that doesn't want to give.
I hope not. Obviously, the world would be a better place if that didn't happen, and I still hope that there's a way around it. I've become quite negative watching what's going on, or not a confrontational stance. And I think you're seeing increasingly on the Chinese side this attitude that we don't really care much what you guys think anymore, and we're going to do what we want, and if there's problems, that's kind of your fault. I mean, that even came out in the recent phone call between Xi and Joe Biden. The Chinese media, when they were reporting on that phone call, stressed this Xi's message that relations are deteriorating, and that's basically all because of the U.S. In other words, we don't have to do anything to make things any better, and that's a frustrating kind of position, because I think in any relationship, whether it's between a married couple or it's between nations, it takes two to have a conflict, and I'm hoping that both sides at some point realize that they're heading in a bad direction for themselves as well as the world, and they find a even if it's going to be a competitive path, hopefully not a confrontational path.
When I talk to Chinese officials or diplomats or others, or academics, one thing they say is China is not an expansionist power. China is not trying to conquer other territories. China is not a colonial power, as you guys have done in your history. Is that correct?
No, actually, it's not. I mean, it's look. I think most people around the world are not particularly well educated in their own history. I think what going on in China is that it's not only that they're. I think people are being fed kind of a fantasy land kind of version of history, which I believe is damaging, because it influences policy, it influences the way the Chinese see the world and interact with the world. There's this misperception that the Western powers, especially the Europeans, were the imperialist powers, and the Chinese, were not. But I think that misperception is caused by the fact that the Western powers were imperialist on basically by sea, and the Chinese were imperialist by land. It's why does modern China look like modern China? It didn't get that way by accident. How did Tibet and Xinjiang and other regions become seen as integral parts of China? So the Chinese have kind of their own colonial history that they're not willing to admit, and they choose instead to create a narrative that they're a victim of imperial powers, which is also true on a certain level, and that they didn't have similar aspects of their history.
And part of that narrative is non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. Has that always been the case?
It depends on how you define non-interference. I think what you've seen over the years with China is when you've had new dynasties that were very energetic and became very strong, they tended to be interventionist around the region. This is when you had, the invasions of Korea or Vietnam. This is when you had the Chinese dynasties expand out west into Central Asia, and these periods were actually not very long. You'll see it at the beginning of the Han Dynasty. You see it at the beginning of the Tang. The Song really wanted to and just were really bad at it, and the Ming didn't do a particularly good job either. They were, and of course the Qing Dynasty, even though they were not ethnic Chinese, were kind of the big expansionist dynasty in their early year, in their early decades as well. So I think when you see these periods in Chinese history when the dynasties were quite strong, and when they were and they knew it, they would be expansionist powers, or at least had a policy of expansionism, even if it wasn't a successful one.
And I do want to get in the audience here for some questions, but let me ask you a couple of quick, rapid ones.
Okay.
Did the Chinese invent gunpowder?
I'm sorry.
Did the Chinese invent gunpowder?
Supposedly the Chinese did invent gunpowder actually sometime in the there are different dates on this, but we know that they had gunpowder in the 10th century.
Okay.
Yes.
Did the Chinese invent soccer?
I can't help on that one. I don't believe Joseph Needham looked into that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Last one before we get to the audience. Take out food. I've actually seen this. The emperor wanted some food from a restaurant.
I can't help with that one either. I'm sorry. That's a different.
Yeah, put you on the spot with that one.
I'm not up on my historical basis of takeout cuisine.
Please, we have some questions from the audience. I'm going to call on gentleman right here first. Please identify yourself. Do we have a microphone? Well, yes, you have to use a mask. I'm sorry if you're going to ask a question. My apologies. So if you don't have a question, put your hand up, use a mask, wait for the mic, and then identify yourself. Thank you.
Richard Ward. Today's FT has an article by Gideon Rock, an opinion piece that basically waves a red flag about Xi Jinping forming a personality cult and cautions against the implications of that going forward. Can you sort of put that in context historically for us? What the implications might be?
I didn't get the very first part of
Could
the
you repeat
question.
the first part of the question?
The first part of the question.
Gideon Rockman in today's FT has a piece, an opinion piece, where he's drawing attention to Xi Jinping's efforts to sort of consolidate power and form a personality cult.
Oh, okay.
And sorry about that. Maybe it's the mask.
Yeah.
And so I'm asking, how do you see that in historical context and the continuity of the historical trend, and what are the implications?
That's interesting. I actually haven't thought about this, so I'm going to have to. I'll do this one off the top of my head. Under old imperial political ideology, right? The emperor was at the center. So, is it a modern kind of personality cult in the way that we've seen, the Soviet Union? It would be interesting. It would take some more research on for me to make the actual real comparison. But in old kind of Confucian political philosophy, the emperor was at the center of the political sphere, and that emperor was supposed to be something of a sage king. That was the ideal was an emperor who was wise and virtuous and would rule with benevolence, and that would then have a magical effect where all of society would also become virtuous and well ordered. And because of that, people were supposed to give their loyalty to the emperor in the way that you would be loyal to your own father. So that's a very simplistic kind of Confucian thinking on it. So it's not unusual in kind of in Chinese political ideology that you do have one person that would be at a central point of things in the way people think about politics and government. In the old dynasties, of course, didn't really work that way, where the emperors had teams of different, scholar officials who influenced policy, and they all debated stuff and they all argued. So in real life, the government, of course, didn't work that way. But in terms of the way that the ideology, that in the way that the government presented itself, had that kind of one-man aspect to it. And also in theory, in Confucian and imperial political theory, the emperor, there were no formal constraints on the emperor's power, right? An emperor had absolute power. What the emperor said was law. The only constraint on the emperor was supposed to be Confucian moral precepts, and that's why his scholar officials were there to keep him on the right path. And this is the way things were supposed to work. The Confucians never quite figured out what to do with a bad emperor. They never really, after 3,000 years of political philosophy in China, they never really quite figured that out. But so in that sense, from a purely historical standpoint, what we're seeing today isn't particularly unusual, though of course it's not necessarily taking it all the same form.
Is that where the concept, the mandate of heaven?
That's
came
the
from?
mandate of heaven is an immensely old concept that some people think actually it's in the classics, and it may date back as long as 3,000 years ago, and the idea that the emperor had basically the divine right to rule, that he was sanctioned by the divine, heaven being kind of a term for the divine. And that actually had a tremendous influence on Chinese foreign policy as well, because if you're the son of heaven, in the early writing of this, the son of heaven had almost a universal quality, that you were basically the son of heaven for the whole world in a certain aspect of the political ideology and the thinking at the time. So if that's the case, how can you then rub elbows with the great unwashed mass of other kings and chieftains and so on? So this created a part of a kind of a foreign policy ideology where China always had to perceive itself being in a superior relationship to other nations and other rulers. So the Chinese always saw the world as something of a hierarchy, not kind of the modern political, European political concept of equal state relations, that the relations were always unequal. And this is an idea that became very entrenched in imperial government and imperial foreign policy and imperial ideology about China's place in the world.
That's interesting. Unequal state relations.
Unequal state relations.
Wow.
I mean, things didn't necessarily in real life. These ideas are controversial among, you get into these ideas of the tribute system, right? And the tribute system has become so contentious in Chinese history circles that you could put 5 Chinese historians in a room, and you get them talking about the tribute system, you probably get 7 opinions and at least 2 fistfights, I think. You have on one side, you have the crowd who came out of the John King Fairbank thinking about this Chinese world order that ran on this tribute system, and with the Chinese at the center of it. And then you have the other camp, which is no, this is a bunch of Western nonsense that a bunch of foreigners kind of came up with in trying to understand Chinese foreign relations. And the Chinese never used the term tribute system. There's no words like that in Chinese political thought. So this is basically made up. For me, I kind of come in the middle. The idea of there being an overarching foreign policy system that the Chinese used in dealing with everybody at all times is obviously not true. I mean, what society, what government does that, right? Everybody adapts their foreign policy to the conditions going on. So that's not the case. But so to then say, well, Chinese foreign relations were just like any other society's foreign relations, that's actually not true either. That there were certain ideological principles, and that in the way the Chinese perceived their relations with the world, the basis of it being unequal relations. And maybe this was ceremonial, maybe it was ideological in real life, maybe things didn't quite work as unequal in that way, but it's certainly how the Chinese perceived it. And when in the old imperial days, if you were ambassador and came to China, you were expected to perform certain ceremonies in which you, in theory, accepted or acknowledged the superiority of China and the emperor in Chinese civilization. And that's how things got written down in the record books, that state X came and became a vassal of China. Again, that may not actually have been true in the way relations actually worked, but it was the way the Chinese perceived their relations with the world. And of course, in some cases, perception is a form of reality.
Okay, we have a question in the back from the veranda. Please don't forget to identify yourself so we know who you are.
Hi, Bill Richards. The revolution in '49 one of its aims seemed to be to wipe away or sweep away Chinese history. I'm just wondering what you think Xi Jinping's relationship with dynastic China now is.
What Xi Jinping relationship is.
With dynastic China.
With dynastic China.
With dynastic China, with sort of
Oh.
Chinese history.
Yeah, I mean, he's interesting because he does, as I mentioned earlier, he does talk about Chinese history with great regularity, and he's obviously, he likes quoting the philosophers. He's obviously quite well educated in the classics and Chinese history, and I think he sees himself on a historical mission to recreate China as the great power that it had been for so many years, centuries in the past, and that's his mission, and that's going to be his legacy, his historical legacy. I mean, it's interesting to think of what's happening in China today as like another imperial restoration. Obviously this isn't a dynasty like the old dynasties, but there are, in very general sweeping terms, similarities between the current government and the old dynasties, especially as power is becoming more and more centralized in China in the form of one person. The old dynasties were always authoritative, top-down states where everything was kind of ruled from the center, and I think, and now with this current government, when you see them reaching into Chinese tradition as an attempt to kind of bring a different form of political legitimacy to the government, you could argue that the government is becoming more like the old, or trying to become more like the old dynasties. I mean, what's fascinating about the communist movement is that, of course, when they started 100 years ago, the idea was to completely remake society. The idea was you needed to have a break with the past in order for China to become great again. I mean, that's what Marxism is all about, right? Destroying the old and bringing in an entirely new society. And this was very appealing to certain people that around the time of the May 4th movement, when political thinking was becoming more radicalized, and the idea that everything old had to go. I mean, one of the founders of the Communist Party actually wrote that in, I think, 1915. It's basically all the old traditions, the old ethics, and all that had to go if China was going to rise again. Now I feel that the Communist Party is kind of trying to change its stripes and trying to connect the current government to the past and make it appear that to be basically a successor government of the old dynasties. They don't, of course, would never use that language, but if you want to read between the lines of the messaging, I feel like they're trying to present themselves as a continuation of China's great past rather than a movement that's completely transforming China into something different than what it used to be.
So like make China great again.
Make China great again.
That's
But in this sense, basically, on a certain level, making it to what it had been.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Question here from Dan, who's not yet masked.
Ask now. So just on that point, sorry, Dan Strumpf, Wall Street Journal. So just on the point you just mentioned of China, Xi Jinping and the current CCP trying to connect with the past, and using the past as a kind of mold. I mean, how far does that go in your view? I mean, what if you're drawing on China's past as a I guess more dominant or ascendant power? How far do these ambitions go in the current time? I mean, is it territorial expansion? Is it economic? Is it cultural? What's the sort of end goal in mind in your view?
That's a really, really interesting question, and actually a really important question, and it's also really, really, really hard to answer. It's on a certain level, this kind of borrowing of tradition, when you look at it, is quite superficial. It's not like suddenly the government officials are buried in the classics again, right? So in some aspects, it's rhetorical more than real. But in other ways, I think it very much shapes, especially the leadership's view of where China should be in the world. And I think you can see elements of traditional imperial foreign policy kind of seeping into current Chinese foreign policy in the way that they see their neighbors, in this idea that basically, our interests count more kind of thinking. And I think you're getting back into some of this idea of hierarchical relationships, that this idea that China has been a great power in Asia and it's going to be a great power in Asia, and everybody kind of has to deal with China on that basis. I also feel that more generally is what else is, I think, interesting about this recurring pattern of Chinese history, that whenever you had a dynasty rising and become strong again, the Chinese tried to basically reimpose their diplomatic system onto other peoples they were dealing with. The Chinese dynasties always liked to dictate the terms of China's relations with the outside world. They didn't like having the terms dictated to them. And I think you're seeing elements of that come into Chinese foreign policy. People in Washington and London and so on, they talk about, how do we fit China into our world order? And I don't think the Chinese see it that way. I think the Chinese see it that we want to determine how our society is going to integrate with the world. We want to determine what the rules are of engagement with us. Does that mean they want to recreate the old tribute system, whether it existed or not? I probably not. But it does, I think, influence the way that the Chinese kind of do deal with other states. I mean, there was this very interesting exchange a few years ago when James Mattis was the Secretary of Defense. He gave, I believe, a commencement speech. This is probably 3 years ago, and he said something to the effect that the current Chinese government wants to be the Ming Dynasty and bring back the tribute system. And there was an opinion piece in the Global Times which started by criticizing him that he's basically a know-nothing and he doesn't understand Chinese history. And then it broke into this, but actually that tribute system was actually kind of nice. And look at how well it worked. It's got, okay, well, are we kind of like, no, so I think there is a view among certain Chinese political thinkers and certain people in the government that this kind of traditional forms of Chinese foreign policy were actually quite successful for China. And I think you can see this kind of bubbling up into what the government does today.
Question here.
Thank you. Philip Cowley. We began by talking about how Americans have a very sort of American-centered view of history, and speaking for the Brits, that's certainly true in Britain as well. Then you mentioned that everybody really doesn't understand their own history. So my first question is the Chinese view of history worse in that it's more self-centered and ignorant, or is it just self-centered and ignorant in exactly the same way as most other countries' versions of their own history are? And then the follow-up question is that if you take Britain and the US as examples, in both those countries there is a real push by historians to push back against the sort of orthodox history of their country and point out some of the inconvenient truths. And I just wonder how that is going in China.
It's interesting because I pitched this idea for the book, and I found a publisher, and then I actually started working on it, and then you ended up with this. I realized that I had gotten myself into something of a fundamental kind of conundrum, which is, what is a Chinese view of history? Which goes back to, okay, well, what is China? Because of course, modern China, is not like, the old Han Dynasty was. So then you get into issues of what is China, and then you get also into issues of, well, what is a Chinese view of history? Because history is, as you said, is always being reinterpreted, and that's of course, true in China's case, of course, as well, where history gets rewritten and reinterpreted and then rewritten again. The way that I chose to do it is actually look at contemporary sources at different periods of history. So you understood how at least the Chinese scholars were writing about their own times and how they saw what was going on. So in that case, you can get a progression of how people, you can start seeing patterns in how people thought about their history and their role, rather than doing something today like, okay, well, how do modern historians looking back on their own history see their own history, which is a kind of a different process. I think what you're seeing is today is what happens in this process, that you end up with a lot of misperceptions. I mean, there are a lot of things that are commonly thought in China today about their history that when you actually go back and read it, it's simply really not the case. I mean, if you want to, if I think the classic example is to look at the Zhenghe voyages in the early Ming Dynasty, how they're written today as a counterpoint to European imperialism. This is how China was able to kind of show to interact with its neighbors and be a great power without actually invading or conquering or hurting anybody, and that this shows that China has a different view of power, and that's again not totally untrue. But when you read about what the voyages actually look like, and you realize how many thousands and thousands of soldiers that he was carrying on these, and the way that the actual Ming scholars were writing about this at the time, you realize that a big part of it was basically to saber rattle and scare their neighbors, and it wasn't, and they did use military force, and they were policing the region, and so things then get distorted. It's people will make of history sometimes what serves their purposes at the time, or how they want to define things, and this gets kind of dangerous in all kinds of ways. Sorry, this is a long rambling answer to your question, but even think about what's going on today and the way China's leaders characterize their relationship with the West. There are two narratives here. You could, if you wanted to, look at your relations with the West over what happened the last 40 to 50 years and say, wow, we've had this great partnership with the U.S. and Europe, and look at all the fantastic things that have happened, and this means that we should continue to have a cooperative relationship with the Western countries. That's not the narrative that's sold within China domestically. They prefer a different narrative of their relations with the West that goes back to the Opium War and the age of humiliations and interactions that happened, in the 19th century. And it's not that that's not true. Of course it is. But it is a conscious choice on the part of the Chinese leadership that they're choosing that political narrative to define their relations rather than a much more current, a much more positive one. So, history can be, and I think all societies do this. This isn't a China-specific thing, but history is what you make of it, and history can be interpreted in ways that serves political purposes that aren't necessarily positive ones.
I think the other part of that question was, if you look in the U.S. and the U.K., they're having this kind of revision of history to
Right.
its extent. In the U.S., they're starting to place more emphasis on slavery as the original sin.
Right.
Is there any scope in China for historians to start relooking at their own history, or is that all?
Sorry, I misunderstood your question. Well, I think the problem in this environment now, where you're looking at increasing less and less academic freedom, increasing ideological pressure for ideological conformity, I don't know how much freedom of action historians on the mainland. I mean, you could have Chinese historians elsewhere going through this process, but I think Chinese historians on the mainland are finding themselves quite constrained. I mean, there's cases of historians who kind of break with the official thinking on certain matters, who find themselves in a lot of trouble. Unfortunately, I don't think right now you have the conditions in place kind of a very, at least, what's the word, an active debate about how Chinese history should be interpreted.
Question right in the middle on the veranda there.
Yeah, you mentioned Joseph Needham earlier. Do you think that China's now going through another Zhonghua burning the boats with the way they're shutting down on learning English and stuff like that? Do you think they're deciding to go it alone again?
It's it's interesting how you see there are elements in current Chinese foreign policy to what the Ming were doing back then. I actually think of kind of Belt and Road almost in those terms as well. The purpose of the Zhonghua missions were, basically to show the flag and show Chinese power, which is recently restored after chasing the Mongols out. So it was part of a kind of a nationalist ideology of the Ming about of the rising Chinese people again, and the Zhonghua voyages were very much a part of that. And I think it's a good, what you're asking is a good question. You see what's happening in like the South China Sea, the idea that the Chinese are in the middle, of course, of a massive naval buildup right now, one of the greatest in modern history, and basically it's are you going to see again kind of Chinese fleets policing the region and imposing kind of a Chinese order. What's interesting about the Zhonghua voyages, of course, is how short-lived they were. Where they only were around for about 30 years, and then the Ming decided not to do this anymore. It was too expensive. So it'll be interesting to see if this current government is going to head in that direction over the long term, and what they do with their new naval power, and what they do with their power in the regional world. How much do they want to assert Chinese authority all through the Asian region, and what form is that going to take?
I don't see another hand, so is there another hand back there? Yes. One more question.
Hi, Paul Murray, Doctor. Xi is such a powerful and authoritarian leader. He's perhaps, from China's point of view, the right man for the times. I don't know if you can answer this, but are you aware of any simmering discontent below the surface? Potential for up-and-comers to look to unseating him when the time is right. Is there anything you can say about that? Escape to your life.
Well, I think we all know that even though the Chinese government likes to present itself as a monolith, that it's not, right? So there's all kinds of factions, and it's my understanding that there are certain elements in the Chinese government and party that don't necessarily agree with the direction he's taking the country on many levels, including relations with the U.S. It's just that right now those voices are marginalized. So the question is, what's going to have to happen in China to reinvigorate these different views and voices and have them influence policy again, and it's not clear what that is at this stage. I mean, somehow Xi is going to have some kind of major screw up of some kind, or things in the economy are going to go badly or something, in order to give other elements with other ideas about where the country should be going the impetus and the ability to kind of reassert different ideas over the course of Chinese policy.
Okay. Permit me one last question as moderator. Just
it's not about takeout food again.
Yeah, no, not about takeout food, which was invented in China. Talk about Hong Kong and the situation that we're in right now in Hong Kong. they're talking a lot now about trying to integrate Hong Kong's economy more into the greater Bay Area and into southern China. How does this all fit into the Chinese view of history? How do they view Hong Kong historically?
Well, that's interesting, because what you can see also happening here in China is that also a different is a conflict of historical narratives, right? Because the view from Beijing is that, you know, the return of Hong Kong was the kind of righting a past wrong, the end of imperial foreign colonial rule on Chinese soil, a return of Chinese people to the you know, the motherland. And again, it's not an untrue narrative, it's just one narrative. And then I think what you see here in Hong Kong is a different historical narrative, because the society here developed under different circumstances. You know, it was because of British rule, it was separated off from the historical, to a great degree, of the historical experiences of the mainland, and you had a society that developed here under different ideals, different philosophy, different relationship with the world, and now you're seeing these two historical narratives kind of clash into each other, and I think that's also, as these clashes will do, created a lot of misunderstanding on both sides, where I think for the Beijing government, it doesn't quite compute what's going on here because of their historical narrative of the situation and the way they like to think of what's happened over the last 200 years, and that's coming into conflict with the way people here identify themselves and see their own course of their own society.
Well, thank you. By the way, they do make a good case for also having invented soccer. Soccer, so you look one to look up. I don't have a copy of the book here with me. But it's over there. It's Superpower Interrupted. We are coming up on the holiday season, so a signed book by the author makes an amazing stocking stuffer if you're looking for something. But I do recommend it. It's called Superpower Interrupted. I'm sure they've got many copies over there. Yes, I'm getting it. They got many copies over there. You're willing to stay around and sign your name in the
Thank
some?
you.
The
Thanks a
author,
lot.
He's willing to stand around and sign his name in some. So thank you very much, Michael Schuman. And there's a complimentary gift bag from the
thank you.
FCC, by the way. So,
Thank you, appreciate it, thanks.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming. Mike will be around a little bit later. He's just going to be over here at the signing table.
Okay.
And thank you all for coming. Keep your eye on fcchk.org for all of our upcoming events. Thanks, man.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Thanks
you.
everybody for coming, I appreciate it.
Thank you.